David Okafor was 38 years old, and he had not cried in 20 years. Not once. Not at his adoptive father's funeral. Not at his own wedding, which ended in divorce 2 years later. Not even the night his adoptive mother squeezed his hand in the hospital and told him she was proud of him. He was a man who believed in numbers. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not beg. Numbers did not look at you with tears in their eyes and ask for one more month. David worked at Coldbrook Federal Bank, one of the largest banks in Atlanta, Georgia. He was a senior vice president in the loan recovery division. His job was simple. When people stopped paying their mortgage, David's team took the house back. It was not a job most people wanted, but David was good at it. He was calm, he was polite, he never raised his voice, and he never, ever let a case become personal. That was the rule he lived by. Never let it become personal. David had grown up in a quiet suburb north of Atlanta, raised by two loving parents, Daniel and Ruth Okafor, who had tried for years to have a child of their own before deciding to adopt. They gave him everything a boy could need. A good school, piano lessons he hated, a bicycle he rode until the wheels fell off. But even with all that love, David always carried a small, quiet ache somewhere deep inside him, a question he never said out loud. Where did I come from? Who did not want me? His mother, Ruth, tried to answer that question the only way she could. Every year on his birthday, she would take the old cedar chest out from the closet, open it slowly, like it held something sacred, and take out a folded blue and gold blanket. She would wrap it around his shoulders, even when he was far too big for it, and tell him the same story every single year. "This is the blanket you were wrapped in the day we found you," she would say. "Somebody loved you enough to keep you warm, David. Somebody wanted you to be safe. Don't you ever forget that." David grew up and grew hard around that soft memory. He studied finance in college, then business school, telling himself that if he could not know where he came from, he would at least control where he was going. He built a career on being the person who did not flinch, the person who read every contract twice, the person who never let sentiment get in the way of a decision. By the time he was 38, David Okafor had become one of the most respected and most feared names in Atlanta banking. He drove a clean black sedan. He lived alone in a condo on the 30th floor with a view of the skyline. He worked 12-hour days and told himself he liked it that way. He had learned, a long time ago, that it was easier to build walls than to ask questions nobody could answer. On a warm Tuesday morning in April, David sat in his glass office on the 22nd floor, looking down at the city. His assistant, a young man named Marcus, knocked on the door. "Sir, the Boyd case is back in the news," Marcus said. "Channel 5 ran a story on it last night." David sighed. "The seamstress?" "Yes, sir. Patricia Boyd, 64 years old. She's been in that house for almost 40 years. The bank is trying to foreclose, but she won't leave. The news is calling it, and I quote, an old woman being thrown out onto the street by a heartless bank." David rubbed his temples. This was the third time this year a foreclosure case had gotten this kind of attention. His boss, Richard Hale, wanted it handled quietly and handled fast, before it became a bigger story. "Richard wants me to go there myself?" David asked. "Yes, sir. He said, and again I quote, 'Send our best closer. Someone with a good face for the cameras. Someone who can make this go away without more bad press.'" David did not like being called a closer, but he also did not like when a case dragged on. The faster it was done, the faster he could move to the next file. "Fine," David said. "Send me the address. I'll go see her myself." He did not know, as he picked up his car keys that morning, that this one visit was about to break every rule he had ever lived by. The drive across town took 25 minutes. David spent most of it half listening to the radio, running through the numbers in his head the way he always did before a difficult visit. 11 months behind. Loan balance, interest owed, property value, numbers were simple. Numbers did not argue with you. He glanced at the case file on the passenger seat. A small photograph had been included, taken by a bank representative on an earlier visit, of the woman he was going to see. She looked ordinary in the photo. Tired eyes, gray hair, a tape measure around her neck. There was nothing about her that should have mattered to him at all. Patricia Boyd's house sat on a quiet street in the Pittsburgh neighborhood of Atlanta, a place full of old brick homes and tall oak trees that had stood there longer than most of the people living beneath them. Some houses on the block were freshly painted, clearly renovated and flipped for new buyers. Others sat boarded up, waiting for the same fate. It was a neighborhood caught between what it used to be and what somebody else wanted it to become. Patricia's house was small, painted a soft yellow that had faded over the years, with a porch swing that creaked gently in the morning breeze. In the front window hung a hand-painted sign that said, Boyd's Tailor and Alterations, since 1987. Beneath it, taped to the glass, was a newer sign, handwritten in marker, that simply said, We are not leaving. David parked his car across the street and sat for a moment, looking at the house. He had seen 100 houses like this one, small, old, full of a family's whole life packed into a few rooms. He told himself it did not matter. A debt was a debt. He had told himself that same sentence 1,000 times over the years, and it had always been enough to get him through the door. He did not yet know that today, for the first time, it would not be enough at all. He walked up the porch steps and knocked. The door opened, and there stood Patricia Boyd. She was a small woman, with gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, and kind, tired eyes. She wore glasses on a chain around her neck, and a tape measure draped over her shoulders, like she had just stepped away from her sewing machine. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Mrs. Boyd, my name is David Okafor. I'm with Coldbrook Federal Bank." Her face changed. The kindness in her eyes turned to something harder. "Another one," she said quietly. "They keep sending new faces. Come to throw an old woman out of her own home. Mrs. Boyd, I'm not here to throw you out today. I'm here to talk. May I come in?" She studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Fine. But I have nothing new to say. I've said it all before." David stepped inside. The house smelled like fabric and warm tea. Along one wall were shelves full of folded cloth in every color. A sewing machine sat by the window, half-finished work still pinned to a dress form. This was not just a home. It was Patricia's whole life's work. "Sit," she said, pointing to a small couch covered with a handmade blanket. "You want tea?" "No, thank you, ma'am." She sat across from him in an old rocking chair. "So, tell me why you're really here. Not the bank talk. The real reason." David opened his folder. "Mrs. Boyd, our records show you are 11 months behind on your mortgage payments. The bank has tried to reach you many times about a payment plan." "I tried," Patricia said, her voice sharp now. "I called that number so many times, every time a different person telling me something different. One person told me I qualified for help. Then another person said no, I did not qualify. Then my payment went up, for no reason anybody could explain to me. I have run this shop for almost 40 years. I have never missed a payment in my life, not once until 3 years ago, when everything changed." "What changed 3 years ago?" Patricia's eyes went distant. "The bank changed something. A refinance, they called it. I did not ask for it. Papers came in the mail, and a man came to my shop, very friendly, very nice suit, and told me it would lower my payment. I signed because I trusted him. And after that, everything got worse. Not better." David wrote a note. He had heard stories like this before. Sometimes they were true. Sometimes they were just excuses. He had learned not to feel anything either way. "Do you have copies of that refinance paperwork?" he asked. "Somewhere," Patricia said, waving a hand toward a filing cabinet in the corner, stuffed so full the drawers no longer closed all the way. "I kept everything. Every letter. Every notice." I may be an old woman, but I am not a foolish one. I just never had a lawyer smart enough or rich enough to make anybody listen to me. I'm not a lawyer, David said, but I do understand paperwork. If you'll let me look at it, I can at least tell you if something looks wrong. Patricia studied him for a moment, surprised. Why would you do that? You work for them. You're the one who's supposed to be taking my house. I'm supposed to be closing a file, David said. That's not quite the same thing. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She rose slowly from her rocking chair, favoring one hip, and shuffled to the cabinet, pulling out a thick folder tied shut with a ribbon. She set it on the small table between them like it was something heavy, something that had been weighing on her for a long time. Take your time, she said. I have nowhere else to be. Not yet, anyway. David opened the folder and began flipping through page after page of letters, notices, and loan documents. Most of it looked like the usual mess of paperwork that came with any mortgage. But then his eyes moved to the wall behind her sewing machine, where a large quilt hung, stretched across a wooden frame like a piece of art. David's whole body went still. The quilt was made of small diamond-shaped patches in deep blue, gold, and a rust orange color, arranged in a pattern that spiraled outward from the center like a sunburst. He knew that pattern. He knew it the way you know your own name. It was the exact same pattern as the blanket he had been wrapped in as a baby. The blanket his adoptive mother had kept in a cedar chest his whole childhood, the one she called his coming home blanket, the one she had shown him 100 times growing up, telling him, "This is the blanket you were wrapped in the day we found you." Mrs. Boyd, David said slowly, who made that quilt. Patricia turned to look at it, and a small, sad smile crossed her face. I did. A long time ago. That pattern is called the Boyd Star. My grandmother taught it to me, and I taught it to my daughter, and my mother before her taught it to me. It has been in my family for 4 generations. I used to make one for every baby born in my family, and a few others besides. David's throat went tight. A few others? Yes. Patricia's smile faded, replaced by something heavier, something that looked like an old wound. A long time ago, I made one more. For a baby I never got to keep. The room went very quiet. David could hear his own heartbeat. Mrs. Boyd, he said carefully, I think I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Patricia looked at him with confusion and a little fear. What is it? David set the folder of loan papers aside, his hands unsteady. He looked at the quilt again, then back at Patricia, trying to find the right words for a question that suddenly felt far too enormous for a Tuesday morning in a stranger's living room. That quilt, he said slowly. You said you make one for every baby born in your family. Did you ever make one for a baby who was not in your family? Someone else's child, maybe? A long time ago? Patricia's face went pale. She sat back down slowly, gripping the arms of her rocking chair. That is a strange question for a bank man to ask me. Please, David said. It matters more than you know. David reached for his phone with shaking hands. He opened a photo, one he had taken years ago of the blanket in his mother's cedar chest, the blanket he still had, folded carefully in his own closet in his condo. He turned the phone toward her. Do you recognize this? Patricia took the phone. Her hands began to tremble the moment she saw it. She brought the phone closer to her face, then further away, like she could not believe what she was looking at. Tears filled her eyes. Where did you get this picture? She whispered. It's mine, David said. I mean, it was given to me. I was found abandoned as a baby 38 years ago, wrapped in this blanket, left at a hospital in Atlanta. My adoptive parents adopted me a few months later. They kept the blanket my whole life. They always told me it was the only thing I had from wherever I came from. Patricia's hand went to her mouth. She began to shake, not just her hands now, her whole body. No, she said. No, it cannot be. Mrs. Boyd, please, tell me what you know. I had a son, Patricia said, her voice breaking apart with every word. 38 years ago. I was 26 years old. I was in a terrible car accident on the highway, coming home from my mother's house. My spine was hurt so badly the doctors said I might never walk again. I was in the hospital for months. I was in so much pain and so much fear I could barely think straight. She wiped her eyes, but the tears kept coming. I was so young then, Patricia said, staring at some point far away, somewhere in the past. 26 years old, working 2 jobs, sewing at night to save up money, dreaming of opening my own little shop one day. I fell in love with a young man I met at church, Charles Whitfield. He was kind to me back then, before his family got involved. He used to bring me flowers he picked himself, said the store bought ones felt fake. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. His family was rich, powerful, old Atlanta money. They never liked me. They thought I was not good enough for their son, not from the right family, not from the right side of town. When they found out I was carrying his child, his mother came to my apartment herself, sat right across from me at my little kitchen table, and told me I would ruin his future. I did not care. I loved that baby before I ever held him. I could feel him kicking at night, and I would talk to him, tell him about the little shop I was going to open one day, promise him a good life. Her voice cracked, and she had to stop for a moment before she could go on. Then came the accident. A truck ran a red light on Peachtree Street, hit my car straight on. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, my back broken in 2 places, doctors telling me I might never walk again. I was so afraid and so full of medicine for the pain, some days I could not even remember my own name. That is when the Whitfields came to me, not Charles, his parents. They told me I was unfit. They told me a woman who could not walk could not raise a baby. They put papers in front of me while I was too weak and too drugged to even read the words clearly, and they told me if I truly loved my son, I would sign. Because what kind of life could a crippled seamstress give a child anyway? David felt like the floor was moving beneath him. I do not remember signing, Patricia continued. I do not remember much of that time at all. When I finally came back to myself weeks later, they told me my baby had been given up for adoption, that I had signed the papers myself, that it was already done, and there was nothing that could be undone. I spent years believing that. Years believing I had done this to my own child in a haze of pain and medicine, and that it was my fault. But I never forgot him, she said, her voice barely a whisper now. I made him a quilt, the same pattern my grandmother taught me, and I never got to give it to him. So a nurse, a kind nurse who felt sorry for me, she told me she would make sure it went with him, wherever he went. I never knew if she did. David sat frozen on the couch, the photo still glowing on his phone between them. She did, he said. That nurse kept her promise. Patricia broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. David did not move for a long moment. 38 years of never crying, and now he felt something crack open inside his chest, something he did not have words for. He knelt down in front of her, and for the first time in his adult life, he let his own eyes fill with tears. Mom, he said, the word feeling strange and enormous in his mouth. I think I'm your son. They sat together for a long time after that, not speaking, just holding on to each other's hands like 2 people who had been lost at sea and finally found land. Patricia kept touching his face, like she needed to prove to herself he was real. I looked for you, she said, for years. I hired a lawyer once, but the Whitfield family had money and lawyers, and they made sure every door I tried to open stayed closed. Eventually, I could not afford to keep trying. I had to accept I might never know what happened to you. I need to know everything, David said. I need to see whatever records you have. I need to understand how this happened. That night, David drove home in silence. He did not turn on the radio. He did not answer his phone when Marcus called to ask about the Boyd file. He sat alone in his condo, high above the city lights, and took the old cedar box down from his closet shelf, the one thing he had kept from his mother Ruth after she passed. Inside, folded with the same careful hands that had folded it every year of his childhood, was the blanket. He held it up to the lamplight and studied every stitch, every diamond-shaped patch of blue, gold, and rust orange, and for the first time in his life, he did not see an old blanket. He saw a message stitched by hand decades ago, by a woman who did not know if it would ever reach him, but made it anyway, because it was the only thing she had left to give. He thought about calling Ruth's memory a betrayal, thinking this way, but he knew, somewhere deep down, that his adoptive mother would have wanted this. She had kept that blanket safe for 38 years, waiting, perhaps without even knowing it, for this exact night to come. Over the next 2 weeks, David used every skill he had learned in his career, the same sharp mind that made him good at finding weaknesses in loan paperwork, and turned it toward finding the truth about his own life. He requested his adoption records, which came back heavily redacted, full of blacked-out lines and missing pages that told him someone, long ago, had gone to great lengths to keep the truth buried. He requested hospital records from the year he was born, cross-referencing dates with everything Patricia had told him. He hired a private investigator, a woman named Renee Castillo, who specialized in cases just like this, cases where money and power had been used to erase a person's history. What they found made David's blood run cold. The adoption papers Patricia had supposedly signed were dated 3 days before she was even admitted to the hospital, which was impossible, since the accident happened on the very day she said it did, and hospital admission records proved it. The signature on the papers, when compared to real samples of Patricia's handwriting from that time, did not match. It was a forgery. The Whitfield family had used their money and connections to fast-track an adoption through a private agency that had since closed down, one that had been investigated years later for other fraudulent adoptions and shut down by the state. David and Patricia took a DNA test together, sitting side by side in a small clinic waiting room, neither one saying much, both of them too afraid to hope out loud. The results came back 11 days later. 99.99% probability of a parent-child relationship. David read the letter 3 times before he could believe the words were real. He called Patricia the moment he finished reading it, and on the other end of the phone, he heard her cry the kind of cry that comes from 38 years of carrying a wound nobody else could see. And there was more. Renee dug into the current ownership of the loan that Coldbrook Bank was foreclosing on. What she found connected everything together in a way David could barely process. 3 years ago, when Patricia's mortgage was suddenly and mysteriously refinanced without her full understanding, the paperwork had been handled by a small lending company that worked as a middleman for Coldbrook Bank. That company was called Whitfield Capital Partners. David stared at the papers for a long time without speaking, his mind racing back through every visit to Patricia's house, every quiet afternoon on that porch, every moment he had spent believing this was simply a painful coincidence, layered on top of another painful coincidence. Now he understood it was never a coincidence at all. It was one long thread, pulled taut across 38 years, connecting a stolen baby to a stolen house, both ends held by the same greedy hand. "It's them," David said, staring at the papers spread across his kitchen table late one night. "The same family. They stole me from her 38 years ago, and now, decades later, they are stealing her house." "Do you think it's a coincidence?" Renee asked. David shook his head slowly. "The Whitfields have owned property near Patricia's shop for years. I looked at city records. There's a redevelopment project planned 2 blocks from her house, a whole new shopping and apartment complex. Whitfield Capital is one of the investors. If they get her land, cheap, through foreclosure, it fits perfectly into their plan. So this was never about a missed payment, Renee said. No, David said, his jaw tight. This was about greed. The same greed that took me away from my mother when I was a baby is the same greed trying to take her home away from her now. And they had no idea the man they sent to finish the job was the very child they stole. Before going to Richard, David drove to the quiet cemetery on the edge of town, where his adoptive parents were buried, side by side beneath a single gray headstone. He had not visited in almost a year. He stood there for a long while, the morning fog still clinging low to the grass, and spoke out loud, the way he had not done since he was a boy. "I found her," he said softly. "My birth mother. She never gave me away, Mom. She never wanted to. Somebody took me from her and lied to everybody, including you." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I hope that's all right with you. Loving her, too. I don't think it takes anything away from what you gave me." The wind moved gently through the trees above him, and David stood there a moment longer before finally turning back toward his car, feeling lighter than he had in weeks, ready to fight for the truth in a way he had never fought for anything in his life. David went to his boss, Richard Hale, the next morning. He laid out everything on the table, every document, every forged signature, every connection to Whitfield Capital. Richard's face went pale as he flipped through the papers. "David, if this is true, the bank could be facing a massive fraud case. Whitfield Capital fed us false information to push this foreclosure through. This is not just bad for Patricia Boyd. This could bring down half our loan recovery department if it gets out that we knew, or even if it looks like we should have known." "I don't care about the department right now," David said. "I care about the truth." "David," Richard said carefully, "I understand this is personal for you now, but you need to think about this from every angle. If we expose this, it's going to be a massive story. Reporters, lawyers. It could take months, maybe years to untangle." "Then it takes years," David said. "That woman is my mother, and she is about to lose the only home she has ever known because a rich family stole a baby and then, decades later, tried to steal his mother's house too. I am not walking away from this." Richard studied David for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right. Do it right. Get everything documented. I'll bring in our legal team and we will handle this the correct way. If Whitfield Capital committed fraud against this bank and against Mrs. Boyd, we will pursue it fully." During those weeks, David found himself driving to Patricia's little yellow house more and more often, sometimes with new documents to review, sometimes with no reason at all except that he wanted to sit in her small living room and listen to her talk. She taught him the names of the fabrics on her shelves. She told him stories about his grandmother, a woman named Odessa, who had taught Patricia to sew when she was just a girl, sitting on the porch of a farmhouse 2 hours outside the city. "Odessa used to say a good stitch is like a good promise," Patricia told him one evening, threading a needle by the window light. "Small, but it holds everything together as long as you don't rush it." David found himself writing that down, the way he used to write down interest rates and repayment terms, except this time the numbers did not matter at all. One evening, Patricia pulled out an old photograph, yellowed at the edges, of herself at 26 years old, smiling, one hand resting on a round belly, standing in front of a sewing machine in a tiny apartment. "That was 3 weeks before the accident," she said, handing it to him. "I want you to have it. It is the only photograph that exists of me carrying you." David held the photograph like it might break in his hands. He did not say anything for a long time. He did not need to. Over the following weeks, the investigation grew larger. Lawyers got involved. So did a journalist named Alicia Reyes, the same reporter who had first covered Patricia's story on the local news months earlier, back when it was still a simple story about an elderly woman fighting eviction. Alicia sat with David and Patricia at the small kitchen table one afternoon, her recorder placed carefully between them, and listened for almost 3 hours as the whole story unfolded, piece by piece. When David finished explaining the forged signatures and the connection to Whitfield Capital, Alicia sat back in her chair, quiet for a long moment. "I have covered 100 foreclosure stories," she said finally. "Families losing homes, banks that do not care. But I have never once covered a story like this. Are you certain you both want this told? Once I write it, there is no taking it back. The Whitfield name still carries weight in this city." "Write it," Patricia said, without hesitation. "Somebody hid the truth from me for 38 years. I am done letting other people decide what stays quiet." David nodded beside her. "Print every word of it. Let the whole city see exactly what greed looks like when it is dressed up in a nice suit." Alicia's story ran 3 weeks later, not as a short segment on the evening news, but as a long, detailed feature that spread across the entire state, and then, within days, across the whole country. It was not about a heartless bank throwing out an old woman anymore. It was about a powerful family who had stolen a baby from his mother and years later tried to steal her home too. And about the son who had been sent, without knowing it, to finish the job his own family had started decades earlier. Charles Whitfield, David's biological father, was tracked down living in a small coastal town in South Carolina, far from Atlanta and far from the family name that had once meant so much to him. He was an old man now, thinner than his photographs, having long ago been pushed aside by his own family's business empire after refusing, decades earlier, to take a larger role in the company his father had built. When David finally met him, face to face, in a small office with lawyers on both sides, Charles could barely look at him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. David studied the older man's face, searching for pieces of himself in it, the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, and found them there, undeniable, staring back at him across the table. "I was young," Charles said finally, his voice weak and shaking. 27 years old, and I did not stand up to my own father, not once, not for the woman I said I loved, not for you. My parents told me it was for the best. They told me Patricia had signed the papers willingly, that she wanted a fresh start without the burden of a child, and God forgive me, I believed them, because it was easier than believing what I feared was true." "And when did you learn the truth?" David asked, his voice flat. "Years later," Charles admitted, his eyes falling to the table. "I saw the real records once, buried in a box in my father's study after he passed. I saw Patricia's actual signature, and it did not match the one on my son's adoption papers. I knew then. I have thought of you every single day since 38 years, and I never had the courage to look for you, because I was ashamed of what my family did, and what I allowed them to do simply by staying silent." David sat back in his chair, his jaw tight. "Do you know what silence costs, Mr. Whitfield? It cost my mother 38 years of thinking she failed me. It cost her a home she almost lost, because your family's greed never stopped, not even after they got what they wanted the first time." Charles nodded slowly, tears finally falling down his weathered face. "I know I cannot fix what was broken. I only hope someday you might let me try to be something to you, even a small thing, even just a name in your history that finally told the truth." David did not forgive him that day. Forgiveness, he was learning, was not something that happened all at once, in one conversation, wrapped up neatly like a closed case file. But he did listen, and for the first time he understood a small piece of where he came from, and it no longer felt like a hole inside him, but simply a hard chapter in a much longer story. The rest of the Whitfield family was a different story. David's grandparents on that side had passed away years earlier, but the current head of Whitfield Capital, a cousin named Preston Whitfield, had been the one who orchestrated the fraudulent refinance on Patricia's home, all to clear her property for the redevelopment deal. Preston had never even known about the stolen adoption decades earlier. He only knew that an old seamstress owned a piece of land his company wanted, and that with the right paperwork, quietly altered, nobody would ever notice until it was too late. When Rene Castillo's investigation reached his desk, along with a formal letter from Coldbrook Bank's legal team, Preston tried to deny everything, then tried to settle quietly, offering Patricia a large sum of money to simply sign away her claims and disappear. Patricia refused every offer. "This was never about money," she told the lawyers in the room, her voice steady despite everything. "It was about my son, and it was about my home, and neither one of those was ever for sale." When the evidence came out publicly, first through the bank's internal fraud report, then through the journalists' growing series of stories, Preston Whitfield was charged with mortgage fraud and forgery. The redevelopment deal collapsed entirely, as other investors pulled out rather than be associated with the scandal. Whitfield Capital Partners lost its contract with Coldbrook Bank, and within a year, the company itself had closed its doors for good, its name now known across Atlanta for exactly the kind of story nobody wanted attached to their business. David felt no joy watching it happen. He had expected to feel something like victory, the same satisfaction he used to feel closing a difficult loan file. Instead, he mostly felt tired and grateful and ready to stop looking backward. On a bright Saturday morning in September, 5 months after David first knocked on her door, Patricia Boyd stood on her porch, her hand resting on a brand-new sign nailed beside her door. It read, in careful hand-painted letters, "Boyd's Tailor and Alterations, since 1987, and below that, in smaller letters, "Mortgage paid in full." The bank, once it understood the full truth of what had happened, had not only stopped the foreclosure, it had cleared Patricia's remaining loan balance entirely as part of a settlement with Whitfield Capital and issued a public apology for how long it had taken them to see the truth. David stood beside her, holding a box in his hands. Inside was the old blanket, the one his adoptive mother had kept his whole life, now carefully preserved behind glass in a small frame. "I want you to have this," he said, handing it to her. "It kept me warm for 38 years, even when I did not know where it came from. I think it belongs with you now." Patricia held the frame against her chest, tears rolling freely down her face. But this time they were not tears of grief. "I never stopped thinking about you," she said. "Not one single day." "I know," David said. "I know that now." Neighbors had gathered on the street, filling the small yard and spilling onto the sidewalk, many of them customers who had brought their torn hems and loose buttons to Patricia for decades, some of them children she had made prom dresses for, now grown with children of their own. Someone had brought a folding table full of food. Someone else had brought a portable speaker playing old soul music low enough to talk over. The reporter who had followed the story from the very beginning stood near the back with her camera crew, filming quietly, respectfully, for once letting the moment simply be what it was, without narration. Marcus, David's assistant, who had become something like a friend through it all, stood near the porch steps holding 2 cups of sweet tea, one of which he handed to David with a small, proud smile. Even Richard Hale had come, standing a little awkwardly at the edge of the small crowd in an expensive suit that did not belong on this quiet street, still adjusting to being on the right side of a story like this one, but glad, in his own quiet way, to be there. David looked at his mother, this small, strong woman who had spent decades believing she had failed her own child, who had kept sewing quilts and dresses and small kindnesses into a world that had taken so much from her, and he felt something settle inside his chest that had been missing his whole life. "I used to believe numbers were the only thing that could not lie to you," David said quietly, mostly to himself. "I was wrong. A quilt does not lie either. It remembers everything, stitch by stitch, even when the people around it try to forget." Patricia smiled through her tears and took his hand. "Come inside," she said. "I still owe you 38 birthdays of tea and stories. We should probably get started. And for the first time in 20 years, David Okafor let himself cry, right there on the porch, in the warm Atlanta sun, finally, fully, home. A year passed. David did not leave his job at Coldbrook Bank, but he asked to be moved out of loan recovery entirely. He took a new position instead, helping build a small division of the bank focused on catching exactly the kind of fraud that had almost cost his own mother her home. Richard Hale supported the change without hesitation, telling David it was, in his words, the smartest business decision the bank had made in years, though David suspected it was about far more than business to Richard, too. Every Sunday, without fail, David drove to the little yellow house in the Pittsburgh neighborhood. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes he brought nothing at all, just himself, and sat on the porch swing beside his mother while she sewed and told him stories he had missed out on for 38 years. Slowly, the shop began to fill with new customers, many of them drawn in by the story that had once nearly cost Patricia everything, now curious to meet the seamstress who had held on to her home and her hope for so long. David learned to sew a simple stitch that year, clumsy at first, his large hands unused to something so delicate. Patricia laughed at him more than once, gently, the way mothers do. "You have good hands," she told him one afternoon, guiding his fingers along a seam. "You just never had anybody to teach you how to use them for something soft." He kept the framed blanket on the wall of his condo, where he could see it every morning before work, a reminder of everything that had been taken and everything that had finally been given back. And in Patricia's shop, hanging in the very spot where the old quilt used to be, was a new one they had made together, stitch by careful stitch, over long Sunday afternoons in the same deep blue, gold, and rust orange pattern that had once traveled with a stolen baby across a city, waiting 38 years to finally lead him home. Some debts, David had learned, could never be measured in dollars, and some homes were never really about the house at all.